Hi, everybody. First of all, we are recording this session. If you don't want to be recorded, please keep your camera off, and you can also change your name in order to not be recognized. If there are additional issues, please write us in the maybe in DM messages so that we can try to address it. Okay, I think that's the beginning. Maybe we can in this session. Okay, sorry for this. Quite nervous myself too. So this is an exploratory paper session, and title of this session is Power, Activism and Commoning. I'm Clara del Gaudio, I'm the chair, and we're going to have 4 papers, and I'm going to go over the papers in a while. Maybe we can move to the next session, the next slide, and the next slide is okay, just about who I am and where I'm talking from. I am Clara del Gaudio. I am an assistant professor at Carleton University. I'm going to chair or attempt to chair, try to chair this session. And I'm joining these sessions from the land that is known nowadays as Ottawa. Ottawa is the colonial name of the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. This has been the place that I inhabit for an immemorial time, and I'm happy to be present in this place today, and also to act as a bridge between local discussion on colonialism and oppression and the discussion that has been going on in this conference over the last few days and probably in the next months. That said, okay, I would like also to invite you, if you want to share where you're from and acknowledge the land you're in, and the traditional custodians of those places, please do it in the chat. How is going to work? We are going to have a very brief introduction. I'll tell you also some ground rules that we're going to follow, or I'm going to invite you to follow. And okay, the first one is to be kind and mindful of differences, and also be patient with technical constraints. We think we're used, since over the last few years we have been dealing with online a lot, but still sometimes we get nervous or we expect something different. The other thing is to maybe come here and from a place of deep listening and respect. And during the sessions, to put your microphone on mute. I might be the first one to forget to do that, just for you to know, and avoid interrupting the presentation or distracting the other participants and attendees. I would also like to invite you to be careful in the words you choose, and try to use a language that is inclusive. And if you need to make some critiques are always welcome, but they need always to be constructive. We never judge or make fun of someone for their ideas. And also to avoid generalization, just to explain where your ideas are coming from. I think that's it for the ground rules. And after this brief moment, we're going to have to know who are the authors that are going to present today. And after that, each one of them, the author of each paper, will present the paper. But this will happen in a synchronous way, I would say. We will share the videos that they pre-recorded for us. And while you're watching the videos, you can take notes of some questions in the chat, and we will ask them these questions in the subsequent 5 minutes. After that, we'll watch the other videos and so on. I hope to have at the end more or less 15 minutes for general discussion, other questions and answers, and reflections together. I think that's it, but I'd like to ask the authors that are here, that are going to present their papers, maybe to introduce themselves and and what is their paper too. Yeah.
I can start, as I am the first one. I am Fabiana Tomasini Giannini. I am from Colombia. I am an architect and designer, and I did my master's in design for interaction at TU Delft University in the Netherlands. When I started my master's, I became like really close and interested about participatory processes with communities, and especially how they relate to power and power structures, and in finding how designers could develop like better practices to have more horizontal relationships when we like collaborate in participatory processes with people and with communities. So that's what my research is about and what this paper is also basically about.
Okay, thank you. The next one, Sarah, maybe? Okay, oh, someone else, that's fine. Sorry.
It's up to you. I don't mind if someone else wants to go
No,
first.
no, I just was the first person that I saw on the screen, just that.
Okay. Okay. Well, then I'll just start. My name is Cyril Tjahja. Unfortunately, my colleague Marlom Aguiar couldn't make it today, so I'm here on behalf of him. We co-wrote a paper together, which is about exploring a different way of participatory design in combination with design activism. And we think, okay, is there something like which you could call participatory design activism? Since in Colombia, with the with all the protests which have been going on in several years, there's been some kind of movements which cannot be categorized in either one of them. So we found it interesting to explore. Okay, what type of things are out there, and to what extent can participatory design be self-organized? So usually it's often design driven or driven by designers, but sometimes it can also arise organically through self-organization. A little bit about myself. I did my PhD at Northumbria University in Newcastle, so it's nice to be at PDC. Myself, I'm based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. I currently work as a researcher, design social innovation researcher at the research organization TNO, and I'm also a lecturer at the VU University where I teach design theory. Yeah, that's in a nutshell.
Thank you. Sarah now?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Armouch, and I'm presenting the paper titled Tensions and Trade-offs in Community Organizations' Use of ICTs for Commoning During the COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm presenting this paper on behalf of my co-authors as well, Clara Crivellaro, Peacock, and Vasilis Vlachokyriakos. I just completed my PhD in digital civics from Open Lab at Newcastle University. Concerning our paper, just briefly to tell you what it's about, we were exploring commoning practices within one of the deprived regions of UK. And we were specifically interested to see how those community organizations were using ICTs specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic, because we knew that they already struggle in normal days, and those kind of struggles were exacerbated during the pandemic. And we were quite interested, and still are interested, to see how digital technology unfolds within such spaces that are already quite constrained. So this is basically what we will be discussing in our paper today. Thank you, everyone. And it's really a nice opportunity to share the space with everyone here today from different parts of the world.
Thank you, Sarah. Justin, a few words to introduce you.
Sure. Hi, my name is Justin. I'm presenting Botswana Blood Comment, Visualizing Blood Surfaces as a Public Comments Partnership. Rosendy is a co-author, and he is here, I think, as well. And Badziili is not here today. But Rosendy is also based at Imagination Lancaster in Lancaster, UK, where I'm based as well. And Badziili is based at the Botswana International University of Science and Technology in Palapa, Botswana. And this paper is a provocation that has led to some further activity that draws on Badziili's previous research looking at reasons for people to not donate blood, and how we can develop an alternative approach which pairs the kind of formal governance system with the indigenous governance system in Botswana called Kotla, using a model called public commons partnership as a way to improve the delivery of blood services.
Okay, I think we have 1 minute left for Rosendy if he wants to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Rosendy. I'm co-authoring this paper with Justin. Okay, I was just checking if my camera was on or not. I'm a research associate, like postdoctoral research associate at Lancaster University. We are both from Lancaster University in the UK. And Justin will be presenting this paper, and I have 1 minute, so I'm trying to do as fast as possible. So I think that's enough from me. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for these brief introductions. And I think we can now watch the videos. The first paper is Towards a Power Balanced Participatory Design Process by Fabiana and Ingrid.
Ethical complexity for the last 4 years. On occasion, I want to acknowledge the community that supported me during this research. I want to thank the community of Afrikaner in Rotterdam South, a community in its majority of first and second generation of migrants coming from many different places in the Caribbean, the Middle East, and North Africa. I thank them for sharing with me who they are and the complexities of their realities. And to you, welcome to our presentation. As a discipline with the capacity to mediate relationships, design has increasingly been understood as a socially relevant activity supporting societal transformation. In particular, participatory design was a big step to democratizing the design practice and opening the space to include the voices of the people intended to use the design outcome. However, as design practices move to the public domain, the profession fails to understand the ethical complexities of working with a democratic approach, ignoring that involving users in a project leads to addressing issues of politics and power. Inserted in a complex system and dealing with different stakeholders, designers might have practices, attitudes, and assumptions that perpetuate oppression and inequalities inside the design process itself. As such, participatory designers can maintain even unconsciously the same power dynamics they are claiming to change, affecting the most vulnerable in the process. The current study aims to better prepare designers to engage in more power balance relationships within participatory projects. For this, 6 different explorations have been conducted in the neighborhood of Afrikaner in the south of Rotterdam, looking for horizontal connections with local residents and finding dialogical spaces for re-evaluating the role of the designer inside the process. Our explorations result in a framework referring to the changing role of the designer in power balance design processes. Moreover, we present 5 propositions that support participatory designers to be better prepared to establish more power balance and accountable relationships when collaborating with communities. The study takes as a main inspiration the work of the Brazilian philosopher Paulo Freire. His work has inspired many scholars and practitioners, especially in the Global South, developing new theories and concepts for design that link from the Western practice, proposing local and hybrid approaches in order to address social issues. The 6 partially unplanned explorations consisted of different ways of interacting with the community in the context. Taking into consideration that PD reinterpreted the role of the so-called ego designer to the role of the facilitator, the explorations demonstrated how this role of the designer can be pushed further. As such, in some of the explorations, the role of the designer transformed into the role of the designer participant. In Exploration 1, the designer participated in the context as a careful observer, while in Exploration 2, the participation consisted in playing a basketball game. In Exploration 3, the designer participated in a street brunch and in a citizens' meeting. The exploration opened spaces for the designer to join and know better the context, its dynamics, and relevant topics for the community. Encountering the community in a more horizontal way permitted the designer to be part of activities and spaces that probably could be unreachable from a position of power and control of the process. In Exploration 4, participating in an open theater organized by the community allowed the designer to understand the values and beliefs of the context from their own point of view, and show other ways of participation framed by the community and for the community. The exploration also allowed for meaningful dialogues with some other participants, as the designer did not need to focus the attention on facilitating any activity. Exploration 5 was a co-reflection meeting to discuss the topic of gentrification in the neighborhood. This exploration showed the relevance of finding common care with the community, as it allows the designer and the community to see each other as partners working towards the same goal. Finally, Exploration 6, consistent of small interactions maintaining the relationship built in the other explorations towards periodical dialogue in the context and online. It showed that the ways of engaging with the community, creating strong bonding and relationships not dependent on any design activity or process. Now, let's talk about the framework that resulted from the explorations. The horizontal axis of the framework shows the different roles of the designer already mentioned. The red color represents the power designers have over the process and other social actors in the project depending on their role. In the role of the facilitator, the designer has more power over the community and the project because in that role, designers still have much of the decision-making, control over the process, the framing of the problem, etc. When moving to the role of the participant, the designer's power over the community and the project decreases as more agency is given to other social actors. As power is relational and contextual, the less power the designer has in the project, the more power the community is capable of exercising, as they are not limited by any designing position defined by the designer. The community's power to act is represented in blue in the framework. If we compare this axis with the Armstrong's ladder of participation, the power and agency of the community translates into more citizens' control in the process. When understood inside a PD process, what the framework shows is that the role of the designer may and should change depending on the moment of the project and what the situation is requiring. As such, the designer can move between being a facilitator, a partner, or a participant depending on any specific moment of the process. This constant re-evaluation of the role of the designer is possible thanks to the dialogue between the community and the designer. Only by creating those dialogical spaces, the role of the designer could be re-evaluated and negotiated with the community in mutual understanding during the whole process. Freirean theory enabled interpreting the exploration as a path for the designer's liberation. As Freire affirms, liberation can only come from the oppressed, who in an act of love liberate themselves and the oppressor. In the same way, in the framework, the designer can be liberated from the oppressive role from facilitator to participant and partner, thanks to the community when willing to interact in those spaces of dialogue. Now let's talk about the 5 propositions that aim to support participatory designers to be better prepared to establish more power balance and accountable relationships when collaborating with communities. The first proposition is that a power balance process is built together with the community. This kind of process entails giving relevance to the relational aspect of the project and giving space to the designer to enter into close relation with people in their context. In this way, comprehension and trust can be built to develop a project structure and plan that aligns and respects the identities of all the social actors in the process. It also presupposes that the designer should not enter the process with a specific end goal in mind, but it will be built together and in dialogue with the community to avoid influencing the outcome, thus giving away power to others to act and decide. The second proposition is that for a power balance process, the designer needs to be liberated. To be able to develop a PD process that is power balanced and more socially just, the role of the designer in PD needs to be reinterpreted. In this research, the liberation of the designer implied de-learning the normalized practices of a designer in a PD process and engaging with the community differently. The liberation of the designer implied a constant re-evaluation and negotiation of the role that could be accomplished by having spaces for dialogue with the community. As such, some practices like spending time with people outside the design activities are fundamental to being able to establish dialogical spaces. In line with Freire's theory, dialogue becomes the tool for the liberation of all social actors involved in the process. The third proposition is that the designer joins the community to design with them. A PD process that is power balanced entails seeing the project as a collaboration and not just as community participation. The horizontal process does not conceive an end user to design for, but considers the community as an equal partner to design with. The fourth proposition is that a project for social justice and change is more than what can be framed by design. Collaboration intends that everyone involved in the process works together and contributes from their knowledge and capabilities. Especially when developing projects that aim to tackle complex social problems, it seems crucial to recognize that the project itself is more than what the design practice can accomplish. Design skills are one more thing brought to the table, as to reach social change is necessary to work with others. Lastly, a power balance process can be built in reflection and action. During this study, it was acknowledged that to build a power balance PD process, awareness of power dynamics and how they affect the relationship of all social actors is needed. As such, the notion of praxis developed by Freire is a useful practice in a process that aims to be power balanced. Doing periodical reflections about the activities and actions taken in the context was, in this case, a good strategy to avoid biases and overpass unconscious oppressive attitudes. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I am excited and grateful to discuss with you and the rest of the panelists ideas and experiences around these topics.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, I'd like to ask if anybody has any question. If not, I have some. I know that listening and writing in the chat at the same time might be tricky. Okay, Cyril is asking, okay, Fabiana is asking what was the content of the reflections meeting that you have, that you had?
The reflections that I was periodically having.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well, and every time I was going to the context, I was trying from a very empirical point of view to see what was happening between me and the interactions that I was having with others. And then what I normally did is that I was writing everything down, and I was going back or to my studio or to, I don't know, the university with colleagues and with mentors, and try to discuss those interactions and how they were affecting my relationship with people and how they were affecting the process itself. So I think one of the most clear examples that I have for that is at the beginning of this research that I was doing with Ingrid, of course. We were trying to develop this horizontal process. But from the beginning, I was trying already to set a process or to set activities of how to do things with people. And I developed an activity that I never did, because before going to the context and doing it, I presented it to some of my colleagues, and we reflected together about it, and we went point by point through it, and how I was talking, what words I was using, how I was framing the problem, how I was framing the activity, and try to see them through the lens of power dynamics. And after that reflection that I had with others, I understood that it was not good for me to do that activity, because I was potentially I could harm others, not in a bad way, but in the sense that I would have more power over them in the process and the activity. And that was what I was not looking for. So in that case, I just changed the whole thing and the whole process, or the way I was approaching the context, let's say.
Thank you. Really, really interesting presentation.
Thanks.
We have a couple more questions. I also wondering if who asked the question wants to maybe turn the microphone on and ask it in person. If not, I can proceed. For instance, Vincenzo, do you want to ask yourself?
Sure, let's see if it works. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So my question is, well, I think it's a very strong and effective image to associate the designers, facilitators with oppressors, quite strong, and very useful for reflecting on the role of the facilitators, the designers. And I wonder if you connect this with the manipulation power of the designer facilitator. I think you already answered actually, but I was writing it before your first answer.
I definitely, I think it does, especially if you compare it with the ladder of participation I was talking during the presentation. I think it's quite clear that many times when we claim to do participatory processes, we are not necessarily giving power to others to lead that process or to like basically change the outcome, because having power is have the possibility to define the outcome or influence it at least. And yes, definitely many times I saw in this specific research that when I was more in the facilitator side, I was having more attitudes toward manipulation or maybe just presenting something to others, but not letting them influence the process itself.
Thank you.
In this regard, and also addressing Antonio's questions too, you say that when you were a facilitator, when you were, so first of all, how do you think it was useful to make clear the different roles, or would be useful to make clear the different roles to the community, the different roles that you're taking on, but also how you differentiate them? What is the difference between being a facilitator, partner, and participants in terms of actions, and how do you distinguish those roles?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I was also questioning myself when I was doing the axis, let's say, and I see it more as a spectrum more than like defined roles. I of course needed to define them just to being able to see what was happening and what I was doing and how I was interacting with the community and how the community was letting me participate. But of course, I don't think they are like specific roles that they are gonna repeat in all the projects. I think it was more what I was seeing in this specific case. And of course, my project and the research I was doing, it was not, you know, like a 4 years research. It was quite short in time. And of course, because I was trying to focus on the relationship I was having with the community, I didn't have enough time. And it was, of course, not a thing that I was trying to do, but I was not having the time to develop a whole process. I was just focusing on the beginning of it. So I also expect that if a process with others continues, and for example, we get to the framing of a problem together, or we start developing something, also there will be more roles of the designer and not just the ones that I mentioned. The ones that I mentioned is just like the ones I saw in this first part of the research.
Fabiana, I need to interrupt you. The conversation is super. Your reflections are extremely interesting, and as everybody mentioned, your presentation inspired a lot of reflections. You have a lot of questions in the chat, so I don't know if you want to follow up with someone later. And we might still have some time for them at the end. I'd like to go forward to the next paper. Thank you for your answer, though. Okay. The paper is Self-Designing Protest. Okay.
Good afternoon, PDC 2022 organizers, presenters, and attendees. My name is I'm an industrial designer, MA in design cultures, and independent researcher.
And my name is Cyril Tjahja, and I'm currently a design and social innovation researcher at the TNO Research Institute in the Netherlands. But when I wrote the paper, I'm still working at the Hans University of Applied Sciences.
Okay, now we will share with you our exploratory paper research called Self-Designing Protest, Exploring Participatory Design Activism Through the Colombian Graphic Design Explosion. First of all, we'll situate you in Colombia's context for the graphic explosion. Since the last government period started in Colombia in 2018, there has been several manifestations of various underlying grievances regarding the environment, human rights, poverty, inequality, and corruption, leading to the longest and more violent protest in the history of the country between April and August in 2021. As a result of the demonstrations, a so-called explosión gráfica or graphic explosion occurred, where artists, designers co-create pro-strike graphic designs. By distributing these visuals through social media, making them available to download, as well as printing, distributing and posting them in the street and strategic locations, the images have become iconic images of resistance.
So the Colombian graphic design explosion shows that there are design activities that fall somewhere in between design activism and participatory design. Even though these activities have the characteristics of both, they do not really fit in either category. We therefore propose the term participatory design activism for these types of actions or interventions. Participatory design activism is characterized by being spontaneous in nature, with no single actor in control of the process, fueled by communication via social media. It does not consist of carefully planned action, but happens in an organic way due to the group dynamics and self-organization of the actors.
The participatory nature of the street protest and the scene that arose because of them brings together active protesters as well as those who were not actually actively involved before, due to practices that could be considered as aesthetically disruptive and which developed spontaneously, thereby further stimulating the creation of messages, designs, and expressions. Now we proceed to present examples of 3 activities that were commonplace during the protest, which use participatory design in an organic way. Here we can see how the street becomes a means of communications and through the participation of citizens, merge individuals into ephemeral collectives in activities such as carnivals, concerts, live printing workshops, painting, and even cooking on the streets. First, we have large-scale paintings, both during their creation and after their completion, have become meeting points and cultural nodes for the community. This typically involves an initial call to create a painting put out by a collective, specifying a particular location in the city. In the surrounding area, communal kitchens pop up, serving food to protesters and collaborators, accompanied by live music performances, as well as exhibition of posters, serigraphy, or photography, which are related to other protests. Due to the large scale of the work, the community plays an active role by joining the designers and experts during these communicative actions and supporting them with labor and materials, but also actively participating in the activities carried out around the painting space. Although it was the collective who initially called for the action and created the blueprint for the painting, it was the community who self-organized its joint execution and all other aspects during the intervention, effectively designing the space of the protest. In second place, we have live screen printing workshops. Between May and August of 2021, several screen printing sections were held with designs alluding to the strike, called mainly by collective and artists. Several of the workshops were carried out in independent bookstores or stores that actively supported the strike, but some were also held around popular gathering places such as public transport portals, universities, and public squares. In these activities, mainly communicated through social networks, the live reproduction of posters, screen printing, or stamping garments were accompanied by other activities, such as the aforementioned community kitchens, large-scale paintings, and live music. These reproductions were often shared or exchanged for food, protective gear, or medical supplies, which enables the protesters to continue with the strike, creating a network of like-minded individuals. In doing so, collaborative spaces were created where graphic expression contribute to mutual exchanges in art, design, knowledge, and aid. And finally, we have empapeladas or empapelatones. This practice involves the direct printing or stamping of designs on paper, in this case posters, which are then displayed on walls, mainly outdoors. Through social media, artists, designers, or ordinary people are requested to bring their own posters, compositions, or graphic to empapelar, which means to cover walls with posters, a specific place and thus create a collective mural. Although this can be done legally, the legal form has no restrictions on location, size, and the message to be communicated. Those who attend contributed by bringing their own graphic materials to paste or use the posters provided by designers or collectives. In this way, both artistic groups and those who attend and participate in these encounters manage to redefine the usage of the walls and the locations, co-creating reference points within the protest. At the same time, they function as street galleries that bear witness to the diversity, creativity, and abundance of the graphic production.
Yeah, so with this paper, we would like to argue that the participatory design activism could address some of the concerns that have been highlighted in the discourse surrounding participatory design. This is, for example, by challenging the dominance of the global north, by analyzing peripheral and spontaneous practices, but also by concerning itself with issues that matter, addressing political issues and outlasting designers' involvement within the process, and finally, decentering the designer from the overall process. It's not our intention to introduce yet another term in the design discourse, nor do we aim to criticize existing approaches in participatory design. But on the contrary, we would like to broaden the common understanding of what both participatory design and design activism practice could be, by introducing cases that do not fit in the existing frameworks. And in particular, we wish to point out that the participatory design can also happen without a designer being the one guiding the process. As social change cannot be accomplished by only design and only designers, this paper argues that instead of perceiving design as a match that lights a fire, it should be seen more as the glue that binds everything together. So thank you for your attention, and here are our contact details, our emails, and anyone, in case anyone wants to contact us or discuss further about the paper. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Okay. Cyril, thank you for the presentation, for the recorded presentation. And we already have a couple of questions in the chat by Antonio. Antonio, do you want to pose them, or I can go? The first one is asking if you look at other similar movements, and if you try to understand the partner similarities with what was happening and you observe in Colombia. That's the first question.
Yeah, it's a great question. No, we didn't, but we would like to have to. But yeah, because it was just an exploratory paper, we just focused on one topic, which is particularly the Colombian design. But I think maybe for further exploration, it's an interesting tip. Thank you for the tip to compare it with other existing movements and how they went about it, and what they encountered and in what ways they expressed themselves. Yeah. I saw the second question is about the design activism that is graphic design focused. It's actually also the same thing. Maybe it's also not coincident because we are both have a graphic design background, so that was also our main interest. But yeah, we're also definitely interested in other types of design, digital design or fashion or whatever, that could also have maybe similar or maybe completely different types of ways of expression. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Okay, we have. We don't have other question for now. I might have one. I think in this paper presentation and the other one, there is a lot about what designers cannot or do not control. So I was wondering if writing this paper allow you to think about something that designers shouldn't try to plan or design. So anyway, that's my question. It gave you some idea what we shouldn't design as designers.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm also very interested. That's also why it's very interesting for me. Also, the first presentation, because the role of design is also something that I often as designers struggle with. You know, when is it too much? When are you guiding the process too much? And when should you let others take over or not? Yeah, I think it really depends on the situation. Also, it's like very fluid, and I think even within one session in one day, you can just I think Fabiana pointed out, you can just change from one role on the other one, so it's not like really like fixed. But yeah, I also have struggled with myself, because as a designer you're a bit of a control freak, of course. and to let that go is very difficult. But I think that it's untenable to to be able to control everything. And on the other hand, if you consider for yourself, whom are you doing it for anyway? Not for yourself. So I don't know. Maybe Fabiana has other ideas about this.
Okay, we have another question, and then we might. Fabiana is answering. Okay. So thank you, Sarah, for this, and I think we might maybe go forward with this later, this conversation. So we have a third paper. The third paper is, just let me remember the name, the title, is Tensions and Trade-offs in Community Organization, Use of ICT for Commoning During the COVID-19 Pandemic, presented by Sarah.
So today I'm presenting the paper around tensions and trade-offs in community organizations' use of ICTs for commoning during the COVID-19 pandemic. First of all, I would like to say that I'm currently based in Montreal, Canada, and I want to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Ghanaian Nation, who are recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters. Moving forward, I just wanted to clarify that when we talk about commons and commoning practices, we are referring to the collective creation, management, and sustaining of community resources for collective benefit. So to give you a bit of perspective and background about this research, I would like to mention that it's part of an EU project that was examining how community organizations and generative commons that produce and use resources with underprivileged communities in Europe and the UK navigate the challenges of access to these resources, including open source platforms and digital technology. When we refer to access, we mention it as emerging from the power-laden socio-technical infrastructures that enable people to benefit from services and resources. In other words, how people are able to derive benefits from the resources that are being co-produced. So the research aims of this specific research study were, again, as I mentioned, to better understand how organizations and commons that produce resources for underprivileged communities through commoning navigate the challenges of access to these resources. And second of all, to explore the trade-offs at play in the choice and use of digital technology during the COVID-19 pandemic to enable participation in the production of commons and the use of such common resources. So as you are all aware, the COVID-19 pandemic brought in a lot of restrictions, lockdowns, and shifts on how community organizations operate. Therefore, for the context of this research study, we were examining one of the most deprived regions of the United Kingdom. We wanted to see how community organizations operated during the pandemic. And that's why we had to expand the definition of commons to include different kinds of community organizations and commons, including community garden, housing schemes, mental health organizations, artist studios, property developer, co-housing schemes, and other kinds of organizations. We conducted 15 semi-structured interviews over Zoom or the phone because it was at a time where there were restrictions due to the pandemic. Based on the findings of those interviews, we realized we had to conduct a follow-up participatory workshop with the participants, and therefore we invited them to a workshop and used Miro as a tool, which enabled a lot of the participants to participate remotely if they couldn't make it to the venue. The workshop aimed to explore what were the current practices of those organizations, the workarounds, the trade-offs they had to engage in due to the pandemic, the challenges they encountered, the access to resources they have, the opportunities for digital technology. So this is a screenshot of the Miro board. As I already mentioned, we had different types of activities to have a better understanding how such organizations had to cope with the pandemic, and particularly focusing on the challenges they encountered and what were the opportunities they felt we could capitalize on and move forward when it came to digital technology. So the main takeaways from this research study indicated that the production and maintenance of community-based common resources entail complexities which were associated with the need to protect already scarce resources while attending high levels of vulnerability. So to give you an example, one of the groups we worked with mentioned that they are responsible of a community garden that hosts both elderly people and young, vulnerable young people. They mentioned that they could not allow those two groups to mix together, and they also had to restrict access of the community garden to the wider public, which is a bit different from what the meaning of commoning meant, but it also meant that they were trying to protect those vulnerable groups from any types of harm. Therefore, when we come back to the idea of access, it's not just about the physical access, but also it was related on the norms, values of care, and relationship of trust that these organizations have established both internally and with the communities they work with. Looking more closely to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, we realized that it magnified challenges related to digital literacy among the communities that those organizations were working with. A lot of them mentioned, for example, that some of the groups they worked with didn't have access to internet. So they resorted to the public Wi-Fi on the public bus. Therefore, they couldn't really resort to digital technology as means to provide services. A lot of them also mentioned that this also indicated that there was a lack of knowledge among communities when it came to digital technology, but also there was a lack of desire to use technology. And specifically, they mentioned that people were not really interested in other kind of digital tools that were different from tools they were already familiar with, like Facebook, for example. So this also raised questions around digital inclusion and accessibility. For other organizations, they mentioned that the COVID-19 pandemic presented an opportunity because of digital technology. This kind of technology allowed them to increase the reach of people they actually were able to work with. In contrast to when they were providing services in person, it also enabled them to create new type of resources, such as, for example, online videos, and it also enabled them to continue their services while being under restrictions and lockdowns. All of the organizations agreed that there were some trade-offs that they had to do when it came to the choice of digital technology. They really had to trade off ethics and control over data, in contrast to using a proprietary technology that were perceived to be easier, familiar, and more affordable, while open source tools were seen to have some technical difficulties that hindered their use. A lot of the other members of staff were not very keen on experimenting with new tools. And for a lot of them, because of the communities they work with, and for many different constraints, they wanted to stick to the technology they are already able to use. So a lot of them also mentioned that there was a limited breathing room to explore possibilities for technology, and they had to use whatever was available because they had to abide by time and financial constraints, which hindered their ability to explore further opportunities when it came to digital technology. So moving forward, we ask ourselves and ask the PDC community, how do we help overcome such barriers when it comes to the use and design of open source platforms and tools? And how do we reconfigure open source tools to be appealing and somewhat easier to adopt? Three things we thought about. First of all, we have to revise and reflect about current practices underlying digital commons, specifically that there is some sort of elitist approach when designing those tools, since they don't really factor in that some people are not very comfortable using these open source tools due to some of the challenges I already mentioned. In addition, we have to co-develop and present proposals for open source tools that are co-created with those living in conditions of precarity or deprivation. And those tools have to be more responsive and relevant to the values and needs of such communities. And finally, we have to capitalize on funding opportunities which endure more ethical digital technology. And this has been noticed by a lot of shifts, even within governments, towards the adoption of more ethical technology versus the use of proprietary technology that are sometimes perceived are not being very ethical. Thank you so much for listening for this presentation.
Thank you, Sarah. While the audience, the participants that are here in this session write their questions if they have any in the chat, I was wondering about the tensions that you thinking about the tensions that you identify and that the organization identify, and I was wondering if what was the reaction of the organization to those tensions, and if any suggestion for participatory design process emerge from that analysis, as well as if they, you already mentioned something, but if they usually can be considered as a resource or for the commons, or they bring up opportunities. So that's something that I'm interested in knowing more about.
Yes, Chiara, thank you for your question. So the thing is about engaging with those community organizations. So a lot of those tensions, as I mentioned, were kind of exacerbated during the pandemic because of like the need to shift to digital technology. And for a lot of them, this shift was quite abrupt because usually they're more used to like live interactions or like delivering services in person. In terms of engaging with such organization, I can mention that it was also quite difficult to be able to access these organizations because they're already working under a lot of constraints and they're overwhelmed. So even when we were trying to design a participatory workshop, like using the Miro board and trying to build on that, it took us quite some time to be able to bring them to the table all together. But then we tried to follow up on the, after like highlighting the challenges and the constraints they mentioned, we wanted to take it to the next step, which is more about thinking about solutions. Unfortunately, we're unable to reach them because they were caught up by the work they do. And because they're already understaffed, under a lot of challenges, we find it quite difficult to invest in a long participatory process. And this is, I think, a recurring challenge when we work with these kinds of organizations or underprivileged communities. People do not have the convenience of time or resources. So we had to think how to create such a space. And this is something that we're still kind of thinking about. Like we even thought about maybe resorting more to speculation, to try to kind of expand the space for those organizations. But one thing I could say they benefited personally from this type of engagement is that we were able to compile all of the tensions they mentioned that are related to financial constraints, that are related to the technical difficulty of using open source, or sometimes because they don't have the luxury to experiment with different tools. So they need like R&D funding, or they need more endorsement from the government. We were able to compile them in a report in a way for community organization, which they were using as an advocacy tool. So I could say this is one way how we were able to support them in a direct way, because a lot of the time in such projects, it's very easy to map out the challenges, the tensions, and to kind of say, okay, this is the kind of problem we're facing. But then when it comes to the solution space, or it comes to something that's more long-term, this is where we find ourselves a bit stuck or faced by wicked problems and constraints that are sometimes at a governmental level, especially in these kinds of community organizations. They are, especially in the UK, they're facing very severe austerity policies as well. So we thought that having at least a documentation that indicates those challenges and tensions, that was written in a way that is very easy to read and to disseminate, was a way for them to also raise it in a way for policymakers to be able to get maybe more support, whether it's financial, whether it's from resources, whether it's related also to universities or researchers to kind of open up the space and start working more closely with such community organizations. I don't know if I answered your question or there's something that I missed, so please feel free to follow up on that.
No, I think you answered. I was just thinking about what you say about the outcome of this being a tool for promoting a dialogue on in other levels, between different levels of organization, and addressing this, or potentially addressing this type of situation. Okay, thank you. If I don't see other questions, but maybe we can come back to, we give everybody more time, and we can come back to this later. Thank you, Sarah. We are a bit behind on our schedules, so if you have time and I have some time, we can also stay longer later to have a shared conversation on these papers. I will now move to the fourth paper of this session, and we have the titles here. Okay, it's Botswana Blood Commons.
Everyone, I really apologize you can't see me. I don't know how to make Microsoft Streams show me, and after so much time, I'm just going to get on with it. So this is Botswana Blood Commons, Visualizing Blood Services as a Public Commons Partnership. I am one of the three co-authors. My name is Justin Sachs. I'm from Lancaster University. And there are two other co-authors, Rosendy Galabo at Lancaster University and Badziili Nthubu at Botswana International University of Science and Technology. And as part of my acknowledgement, rather appropriately, I'm speaking to you as the white person, man from the global north in these, as you can see on the slide. But I'm also less visibly the one queer person of our group. And I think I like to draw on that experience as a queer person and a member of allyship programs at my own university as part of thinking about how we decenter ourselves and support others, and also at the same time think about how it doesn't work. For me, this paper presents an important question about how to be an ally. I do have knowledge and experience as we're sharing, but I also know that I want this knowledge and experience to center the work and the struggles of other people. So I think I acknowledge that I am constantly trying to figure out what the boundary is between genuine and humble allyship and ego. So without further ado, the research question here is, what role can the commons play in improving citizen trust in healthcare services? And leading to the title for the paper, specifically, we're looking at what role can the commons play in improving citizen trust in blood donation to address chronic blood shortages in Botswana. And in response to this question, we've adapted several frameworks to support the visualization of a different governance system in Botswana based on partnership between the parliamentary republican system and the indigenous governance system known as COLA. So a word about blood supply in Botswana. There have been chronic shortages for years, and the country suffered an acute crisis in 2020, as many countries did. So workshops led by Dr. Nthubu identified the following barriers to trust in blood services. So first and foremost was a lack of trust in blood use. So what happens to blood after it's donated? Second were negative perceptions, often culturally and religiously tied around donating blood. Third was bad hospital experiences, such as relatives waiting days to receive blood in hospital. And this also led to a lack of incentive, since this didn't feel like a goodwill process. Where was the incentive in this process? So if we start this design process, assuming these concerns are valid, which we should, what is needed here is not more information campaigns or community ambassadors, which are all designed to move people from one position to another. What is needed here instead is a different approach to designing the management of blood donation, as well as the rest of what we call blood services in this paper, which includes donation, as well as transfusion and logistics. And so what we're looking at in this paper is how can this parliamentary republican governance cosmology around how blood donation works, and that dominates the design of blood services, how can that interact with and privilege the indigenous COLA cosmology to design this shared governance system for blood services? So first, the COLA, what are they? So Botswana has an intact and recognized indigenous governance system called COLA. COLA is the name for both the customary governance system in these villages, and it's also the physical space where meetings take place, which you can see in these photos. So the COLA is both a forum for discussing the developmental agenda of the village, and it's also the justice system used for resolving community conflicts. Communities, common scholars, dating back to at least the 1990s, have recognized COLA as a type of commons. Though interestingly, this research tends to focus on how COLA can manage so-called natural resource systems like grazing land and river deltas. There's not any known literature, in the commons literature at least, that extends this COLA governance to social policy areas like blood services. Now, importantly for this paper, while a single COLA is a commons, to address blood services at a national level means looking at how these many COLA interact. So we need to look at commons as an ecosystem, or commons ecosystems. So we looked at two frameworks to do this. So the first is this jigsaw framework, which we're drawing on as a way to map ecosystems. And we chose this framework because it has previously been developed and applied within Botswana around ecosystem development, specifically craft manufacturing ecosystems. And what we'll focus on in this presentation is the position generator method used to identify stakeholder positions and measure connection strength between stakeholders. So on the left, we have this template visualization, and on the right, we have a participant who's using the visualization in a workshop. And there are a few features of this visualization. The first are segments. So it's not just, there are some you can see kind of divided like an orange.
And the idea there is that the participant can categorize their contacts in their ecosystem using the areas they decide for themselves, maybe inputs or advertising. And then these concentric circles allow the participant to map their contacts. And the stronger the contact is, the closer to the center, because the center of the circle is the person doing the visualization. And finally, what's really interesting is when the participant will then compare their visualization with the visualizations made by others in the community, particularly from other positions. And that's where we see how these worldviews align and diverge. The challenge, though, in this paper, or that we pose in this paper, is that the COLA aren't currently imagined as part of this blood services ecosystem at all. So in order to get them in there, we need to first revisualize or politicize this visualization tool to prompt consideration of a blood services ecosystem where COLA fit. To do that, we drew on the public commons partnership framework. There aren't that many frameworks for commons ecosystems, and we selected this one as kind of the most relevant and articulate for our context. On the left is the original version, and on the right is our simple adaptation. And there are kind of 4 features of the framework. The first is the common association. So there's some kind of federation of these commons, and in our version, we call that the COLA association. Next is the local authority. So that's the government organization involved. And in our example, that's the NBTS, which is the National Blood Transfusion Services. Then these come together to form a joint enterprise, and enterprise may not be the right word, but some kind of joint initiative. And in ours, we call that the blood service. And finally, there's this box on top that isn't labeled, and which we later call other stakeholders. And so that kind of comes in from the top. And those are people who aren't either one, but are important to this partnership. Next step I wanted to do was to map, to translate this model into the visualization tool already being used in the Jigsaw framework. And so what happens is that joint initiative, the blood services, becomes the center of the visualization, just like the participant would be in the workshop. And then we have these 2 worldviews that have to find a way to interact with each other. So we have the COLA association and we have the NBTS. And then what we've done is we've turned this last segment, the other stakeholders, that box from the top, into the third segment, which is probably some combination of stakeholders identified by both the COLA association and the NBTS. Lastly, we have this thing called choice levels. And so in the Jigsaw visualization, the participants use the strength of the relationship as an indicator in mapping the contacts. But we thought this might be a way to actually incorporate an important feature of commons literature, which is called choice levels. And what these choice levels describe are the roles people play in different types or levels of decision-making. So it's nested decision-making. And there are 3 choice levels: constitutional, collective, and operational. And in this model for the COLA association, we can kind of work from the inside out very quickly. So let's say there's a blood donation site in the village. Only certain people need to be involved in decision-making around that. So they're involved in the operations of that donation site. And you may have examples of your own community where only a small number of people are involved in a specific event that might be part of a wider committee. And so this small group is part of a larger group, which is the collective choice level. And that group might actually involve maybe others involved in transfusion or SMS messaging, and maybe they need to make some collective decisions across these groups together. And so that's the collective choice level. And then we move up to the next level, the constitutional choice, and that's everyone who constitutes the commons. So we've combined everyone from these other 2 levels together. But just like with elections, not everyone has to be involved in every decision and all the way down to donation sites, right? There may be only certain decisions where everyone has to get involved. And so this kind of nested governance would also exist for the NBTS, the other segment. The outermost ring I introduced is called external, and that is a way for identifying who might be part of this commons, but not as constitutional members. So maybe the COLA association relies on private drivers at donation sites, and these people need to be involved in decision-making, but they aren't necessarily part of the COLA association. So that was an attempt to kind of give some structure there. And then finally, this last visualization from the paper is just trying to kind of put these all together. And so we have a process where the COLA association and the NBTS separately go through a process of categorizing and mapping these contacts. And then we look to combine those together here by combining what they do for themselves and then also the other stakeholders they identify. And then there's a process that will be very interesting about how to find a way of reconciling and integrating these different worldviews to create a public commons partnership. And so that is what we're doing next. And here are our contact details. That is the end of the presentation. We welcome your ideas and collaboration and look forward to speaking.
Justin, thank you for your presentation. We already have a question from Antonio. Antonio is asking if you have any literature resource that explore choice level with commoning.
Yes, there are definitely some refs in this paper, and then I use choice levels in other papers. So maybe on my Scholar or Lancaster peer profile, those will be there, but just message me, I can send you. It's a very, it's one of many topics that's pretty core to the Commons literature, but is often missed because I think outside the Commons kind of silo, people kind of draw, particularly in design, draw on the design principles, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff there. And so, yeah, just if you look at my paper and message me, and there are some other refs in the papers, so kind of like key texts that discuss the choices.
While we wait for other questions, not answers, I was thinking about the visualization tool or mapping tool that you use, and in the paper, you and your co-authors mentioned that you try to weave different worldviews into it. So I was wondering, and obviously you explore also different ways of representation, but what are still the limitations of representing different worldviews still in the way you represented it, and what are maybe the implications from a power perspective of that, of those? Yeah.
I'll answer.
Cannot hear you, sorry.
Oh, I said, can you hear me?
Yes, now yes.
Okay, so I said I can quickly respond or send maybe some thoughts. Well, clearly, and I think this is what we'll unpick in the next steps of the process, where visualizing them on pieces of paper, or we have to use medium for visualization. I think the medium of choice matters a lot. So I don't know what the right medium for visualization is. The Village Association, that's kind of what those working with us would try out. I think it's probably one of the biggest issues. And I think I'll stop there. I think that was kind of the first, that's kind of the first thing on my mind around what we do with visualization. I'm sure there will be so much more that happens when actually trying it. Rosendy, do you have other ideas?
Yeah, sure. I think the most challenging thing is really to have the government, like the public institutions, to really listen to this mix of different cosmologies. Because like to build the ecosystem, you have to create this like different actors. And then it's hard to map if you don't have the different groups of people, like the hotlas, and then you have the government, and also the people involved in the process, like the other stakeholders. So this would be like the challenge, is really initial challenge, is really to get these people together and see, look, there's another way to sort out this challenge, this blood issue in Botswana, is really getting together and see that you should give power to people to really change. Because if you don't have the government or the people who really have the power, things won't change. You'll just you'll be doing participatory design without empowering people to change. So like I think the biggest challenge is really to get the people in power to enable people to change the systems. Otherwise, I think that's going to be harder for you to start mapping. So what we did in the exploratory paper is to really propose a visualization on how to support this conversation, I would say, how it should start. Like, okay, let's map the people that should be involved in the process. And then after that, we can come together and decide what to do with this issue.
Just to restate, because apparently my sound was off, in response to Antonio's earlier question for choice levels, there's references about choice levels in this paper, and then if you message me or look at my Scholar profile, other papers talk about choice levels. So there's a few key references. And in response to the question about the kind of visualization challenges, I think the one we're going to hit first is the medium we use for actually visualization, because we won't be necessarily using certainly anything electronic or necessarily a piece of paper. what is the best medium for doing that, and respond to the way that people are used to kind of collectively discussing things.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the participants of this session, the audience? No, okay. So we are almost at the end of our time. We can also stay longer if we want to explore some of these topics. But I think the first questions that I might want to ask is for the presenters, if they have any questions to for the other presenters of this session. If there is something in what they presented that really resonates with their work. The people in this session have been brought together because of some affinities. So that's maybe, I think this can be a space for deepening our research connections and collaborations. So if you have any question, I'd be happy to have you posing them. If not, I might have, okay, yes, please. I'm always too fast. Okay, yeah, tell me.
I cannot turn my camera on because I think maybe Chiara, you stopped it and now I cannot turn it on by myself, but it's okay. Okay, now I can wait. Yeah. I think my question is to Cyril, because when I was, like reading the paper and hearing the presentation, I was wondering if you guys found any, I don't know, any activities or any practices that designers in this case can have to collaborate more closely with like social movements or activism. Like if you found in your research any common areas or any common practices that can be like useful to share with others to be like more just and probably also more accountable when we do this.
Yes, good question. Thank you. To be honest, I don't know the answer to that because my colleague Marlom is the one who did that part of it because he's the one who's from Colombia. But maybe we can discuss this further together. And yeah, it's a good question. Very interesting. I think that would be also something worth for us to explore further in a later session. But yeah, sorry, I can't answer the question myself at the moment.
It's okay.
Yeah.
We had a question from the names are always difficult for me, from Rosendy. Yeah, the mayor and okay.
Oh yeah, sorry. I asked you the question, Fabiana, but then I realized like the latest question that we answered, you partly responded that you were doing the exploratory one and it was not a 3 years project. But I was just wondering, because like, let me read what I asked, to be honest. I was saying, oh yeah, do the new roles mean that the PD is moving towards a post-participatory design where design should support communities to have / lead their own participatory design processes? So I think from your exploratory part, you just said you're working on the relationship, but because you answered the kind of this question in terms of, oh, you know, that's just a diagram, like a framework, and there might be other ways to visualize that. So I was just wondering, what would be your next steps? Because you built a relationship, and what would be the next thing you're thinking or you would like to explore next as your research?
I think that when I ended this part of the research, which was again more focused on the relationship and how to like how I could find better ways to engage with people, well, first of all, I let like the process flow and see what was happening. So I was not establishing like several steps or like very defined steps. So of course I was open to see what was coming next without expecting it a bit. But for what I was seeing, I was already being able to frame a bit what the community was interested about working on. So it was a matter of luck and meeting the, let's say, right people, in the sense that I was starting to meet people that is very active in the context, and they were guiding me through the context. So I was already like spotting some topics that were important for the community. So I think the thing that was coming next was to see how I could support them in those struggles. Like, what could I do from my side and from my little knowledge in all of this, like support them to do. And again, I think their role also in that part and that involvement will also change depending on the process. But yeah, I was really hoping I could get like, like maybe we could focus on one struggle now, or and keep it on and see what happened. But yeah, the project was so short that I was not able to do that.
I think I'll go back to maybe just for one last reflections to the tools that Sarah, the tools that have been used during the research for Sarah and Justin and Rosendy, by Sarah, Justin and Rosendy. And I'm really wondering, also considering what Sarah mentioned about having tools, different type of tools, but digital tools more accessible. What are the strengths and issues within participatory design processes of the ones that you chose? Strengths or weaknesses, not issues. Because we've been using some of them, at least. I haven't been used the one used by Justin and Rosendy, but I really often think about them and what they enable and what they prevent. And thinking about power, I think this is an interesting reflections to have. So.
In terms of the tool, it was developed by the other colleague or other co-author. So I don't know much about the whole process, but I can tell about the process that I often do in terms of co-design. So like the way I do co-design to enable people to like have more power, like in terms of empowering them, is to co-design these tools with them. So like with a specific community of practitioners, can even, like I would say, mostly the people that I work with is the public sector. When you co-design these tools, you enable them to have this ownership. And also there is a weird thing when you're co-designing some specific tools with the community, is that because they take ownership of the process, the weird thing is that we don't understand the design process anymore. What does that mean? So instead of going for, oh, let's do persona kind of tool, which we are well aware of that because, well, we have design background, we've been trained, we've been educated for over 3, 4, 5 years, whatever. When we looked at the tools they design for engagement, it's kind of alien for us, but it works more naturally for them. So by doing this kind of process of co-designing tools, you enable them to have ownership and also to have more freedom to be creative in their own way. So like when I ask the question in terms of post-participatory, it means that we're kind of designing things for others to use, which means like even for other people to do a participatory design without the designers. So when I was like kind of provoking Fabiana, it was like, well, I don't see in my approach having the designers even in the scale, like in the diagram, because we kind of become outsiders and support others to do the participatory design instead of us controlling us in terms of having power of creative process. So I think it's not in the paper, but just like because you asked about what kind of bars and other things that can enable people to engage in the process. So I would say it's really co-designed with the people and no matter how we kind of find weird, but for the local community will look more natural for them. So like in terms of designing even digital, it's to enable this group of people that we work with to really design the tool instead of using our way of thinking. Of course, there's a lot of literature in terms of professional design and informational design and creating hierarchy and stuff. But I think if we enable people to create their own tools, digital or analog, they can come up with something more innovative that we were not even thinking, and could be more natural for these people to have control of the process, because they will know more about the process, instead of having, as Sarah was talking, using the private kind of tools, because Microsoft or whatever other company, they impose the process and how it needs to be used, but instead it's coming from the people's process, instead of coming up and imposing this is how you should work. So I think co-designing tools with people will enable them to have more flexibility in use, and also empower and have power over and control over the processes. So that's just a comment in terms of designing tools.
Building on what Ross said, I agree with the point you mentioned, and I'm going to answer this question and Mela's question as well in the chat concerning our project. So taking a step back, the original aim of the research we're doing is, like I mentioned, it was like a big EU project, which was trying to see how can we support these commoning practices, because if we think also about participatory design, it kind of aligns with the values of commoning and building these kind of commons that are all around participation and having more people involved in the production of resources. So one of the aspects was to see what's the role of digital technology in all of that, and is there a role to begin with? In our case, if I want to talk, so we didn't have specific tools that we wanted to impose on these organizations. While it's not in our paper, we did do a prior research ourselves on some of the existing open source tools, just to see from a technical perspective, we had a team of developers to see what were the technical restrictions and what could be added to improve their use and ease of use. And so we kind of compiled that, but moving this conversation to the community level, we wanted to understand more from their perspective, their own experiences with such tools, if they did try to experiment. For some of them, I think if it wasn't for the pandemic itself, they wouldn't even consider digital technology as a way forward because of the challenges I mentioned about the communities they work with. So sometimes it's not just at the organization level, it's also the communities at the receiving end where you would find challenges when we're thinking about the design and co-design of these processes. So I think starting the conversation with these groups is the start of this process, without necessarily thinking that the end product will have to be a digital product in this case. It could be maybe reconfiguring the way these organizations are kind of delivering their services at the time. But if we're also thinking about digital innovation or social innovation, I think we have a challenge, which is, I don't have the answer to it, where it's really hard to move beyond some of the proprietary technology that's being used now, like social media or even WhatsApp, or which are incorporated in the work of such organizations in a way that it's making it really difficult, even when we're thinking about designing open source platforms or even digital commons. Even if we do bring community groups to the conversation, to the table, and do these processes, and this is something that I've done in my own PhD work, there's always this resistance that, okay, we did this kind of co-design within the workshop space, but then when it comes to real life, are they going to actually use the tool? Is it going to survive beyond the funding of the project, or is it going to be incorporated in their day-to-day? And this is, I think, in its own is something that I see in most PDC papers, where people end up their papers by saying that, how do we ensure sustainability? How do we convince people? And going to Mela's point about people being inclined to use ethical technology, which sometimes we think that, yeah, digital commons, open source are more ethical because you control the data as an organization. It's not somewhere in the cloud with one of the admins of Microsoft or Google or. They did not have this appeal of mix and matching, because for them, they found that these two sets of technologies are like so different in a way that it's either we have to use Facebook as it is, or we have to shift to something that's similar but open source, or we use Nextcloud as an organizational tool, or we use Google Drive. One way forward might be merging the two in a way. So one of the things that some work has been done, which is called unplatforming existing tools, is where you do have like Facebook, but then you built an add-on, which is something we did experiment with, where you have like a website that's more open source, but it has a connection to something that's already used by people like Facebook, WhatsApp, blah, blah, blah. Not that you want to promote those tools for all the question marks they raise, but I think it's inevitable at some point, especially when you're working with deprived communities, especially when you're working with communities where you have issues of digital literacy, where you have issues where you're working different age groups, where you don't have money, basically, where you don't have support. You need to find ways to kind of build these hybrid products in a way. And sometimes it might be just giving up technology altogether and creating more social processes that are more participatory and more aligned with the values of commoning and commons. So I don't know, it's a very interesting question, and I don't think I have a clear-cut answer, but these are just some reflections from the work from this research and from other research that we've done like throughout the years in a way.
Justin, do you have something?
You do it really quick because I can hear. I think this is a slightly different take on. It's a really great question around the opportunities and barriers. I think what was mentioned in the video presentation of our paper, and it's in the paper a little bit as well, is the tool itself is actually pretty simple. The visualization tool, that's not probably news for a lot of people. It was how do you politicize, introduce alternative conceptions of how the world works into these tools, and we tried that. So actually take a look and let me know how we did. Like, how do we represent something like commons in these tools? Because if no one's heard of it before, how do you put it in there and get people thinking about it? And so that to me is, that's what I'm really interested in, is how do we politicize these tools, whether they're simple or more complex, to think about alternative systems of alternative economics. And those can be linked, that the alternative economics could be the part that's really kind of difficult to kind of challenge people, whether because the idea is foreign or because people are resistant. So yeah, so I kind of welcome your thoughts on like how well we actually did at kind of making a start at that. But you know, it's not always about the tool itself or the technology, but about just like the ideas themselves and getting people thinking a completely different way.
Yeah, I only think that sometimes, well, always tools are designed based on certain values and principles, so sometimes they don't fit. I've been trying to, experiment with something with one of my students. She was here before, but sometimes you face that is impossible, but still it might be useful for. So everything has strengths and weaknesses. So what's the strengths of the tool that we're using? And how we can, not just disregard everything just because it doesn't fit perfectly. So just a general reflection there, but thank you. I unfortunately have commitments later, full day of meetings. And I think I also live with the general reflections on control or being controlling design and all these things, tools or not tools or process, both as designers and as participants, and what that means. What does that tell us about participatory design? That's what one of the things I'm going on with. I need to close the sessions, but I want also to say something about the next sessions. Next sessions will not be today, but tomorrow. And there is one more slide. I don't know who is the host now. Maybe John. Okay, thank you. So the next session is tomorrow. Yes. UTC time, 7 a.m., 8:15 to 8:15 a.m. We have a full paper track, a bit too early for me, but I might check it online. And later we have exploratory papers from 8:30 to 9:30 a.m. We have 2 sessions, and later on, we have situated actions. So we have a full program, and we are only in day number 6 today. So I invite you to join tomorrow in the next few days, and I hope to see you online and exchange some ideas. Thank you for this.